Welcome to Aphelion. This is a place where philosophy arrives quietly. No arguments, no pressure, no attempt to convince anyone of anything. We simply take a subject and look at it carefully, the way you might study an old map, noticing what matters, what can be set aside, where people tend to lose their way, and where they might find themselves again. Tonight the subject is Stoicism. Before we begin, if these slow philosophical reflections help you settle your mind and rest, consider leaving a like and subscribing to Aphelion. It helps other people searching for meaning find their way here. And if you fall asleep before we reach the end, that is not a failure. That is, in its quiet way, exactly the point. Find a comfortable position now. Let your weight settle into whatever holds you. Let your shoulders drop a little. Let your hands rest open, or closed, whichever feels more natural. Notice your breathing, not to control it, just to notice it, the slight coolness of air coming in, the small warmth of it going out. That rhythm has been with you your entire life. It will carry you through tonight. Now, let us go back. Not as far back as the beginning of the universe, or the origin of our species, though those journeys have their own kind of beauty. Tonight we go back to something more specific, more intimate, more unexpectedly close to the present moment than you might expect. We go back roughly 2,300 years, to a city that still exists, to a language that still echoes in the words you use every day without knowing it, to a set of ideas so practically constructed and so deeply thought through that a Roman emperor, a man who commanded legions, who decided the fates of nations, who had every comfort and distraction the ancient world could offer, wrote them down in a private notebook. For no audience at all, simply because he needed them in order to live. That is where we are going tonight. That is the territory of Stoicism. And I want to say something here, before we enter it. There is a reason you might have found your way to this particular subject tonight. Philosophy about how to live tends to arrive in people's lives at particular moments. Not when things are going smoothly, not when the days feel ordered and purposeful and sufficient, but when something has shifted, when the ordinary arrangements of daily life are under some kind of strain. When the question of how to keep yourself oriented in the face of what is actually happening has become pressing enough that it cannot be entirely deferred. If something like that is true for you tonight, if you are here because something in your life is asking a question that comfort and distraction have not been able to answer, then I want you to know that the men we are going to spend this night with were asking exactly the same kind of question, under considerably more difficult circumstances. And they found something worth finding. You may find it too. And I want to tell you, before we enter it fully, there is a reason this philosophy has survived. There is a reason it has been read continuously, without interruption, for over 2 millennia. Not because it is comfortable. Not because it flatters you, or tells you the universe is benevolent, or promises that things will work out. It has survived because it is honest in a particular way, and because its honesty, strangely, is the thing that helps. The thing that has helped soldiers and slaves and emperors and prisoners and farmers and writers and, yes, people lying quietly in the dark at the end of a long and difficult day, trying to find some ground beneath them that will not give way. You may be one of those people tonight. That is all right. You are in good company. The best company, in fact, that history has to offer. Let us begin. The Painted Porch. Imagine Athens in the year 300 BC. Not the Athens of our imagination, the clean white marble of photographs and architectural drawings, all those columns gleaming in abstract Mediterranean light. The real Athens was noisier than that, more crowded, more alive with the smell of bread and salt fish and olive oil and the particular dry heat that settles into limestone streets in midsummer. The agora, which was the central public space of the city, was not a monument. It was a place of continuous human activity, a place where merchants argued over prices, where politicians gathered supporters, where philosophers walked in circles talking at anyone willing to listen, and where, if you were paying attention, you might encounter an idea that would quietly rearrange everything you thought you understood about how to live. The Stoipoikal, the Painted Porch, was a long, roofed colonnade along the northern edge of the agora. Its walls were decorated with large murals depicting the great military victories of Athens, the Battle of Marathon, The sack of Troy, scenes of warriors and fallen soldiers and the complicated, brutal theater of war. The porch offered shade, which in an Athenian summer is not nothing, and a view of the agora's daily movement, and enough acoustic shelter from the surrounding noise that a group of people could gather and actually hear one another speak. It was here, sometime around 300 BC, that a man named Zeno began to teach. And the school he founded took its name from that place. His followers were called, simply, the people of the porch. In Greek, hoi stoikoi, the Stoics. Zeno of Citium, Citium being a city on the island of Cyprus, had come to Athens by accident, or by what looked like accident, which is to say by the kind of shipwreck that, in retrospect, looks almost designed. He had been a merchant, carrying a cargo of purple dye across the Aegean, when his ship went down. He arrived in Athens with nothing, or nearly nothing, and found his way into a bookshop, where someone was reading aloud from Xenophon's Memorabilia, a record of the conversations of Socrates. Zeno was captivated. He asked the bookseller where he could find a man like Socrates. The bookseller pointed at a philosopher walking past in the street. That philosopher was Crates of Thebes, a cynic, a man who had famously given away his considerable fortune in order to live according to nature and without pretense. Zeno followed him. He studied under him, and under other teachers, for years. And then, when he was ready, he began to teach himself. What Zeno taught was not a simple thing, and it was not born in a single moment of inspiration. It was built carefully, piece by piece, from elements he had gathered from the Cynics, from Plato's Academy, from the logical rigor of the Megarian school, and from his own careful observation of what it actually meant, in practice, to live as a human being in a world that did not organize itself around human convenience. He was building a philosophy in the way that a craftsman builds something intended to be used, not for display, not for admiration from a distance, but for the daily friction of real life. The school he founded did not remain unchanged. Zeno was succeeded by Cleanthes, who was succeeded by Chrysippus, and it was Chrysippus, prolific, systematic, ferociously intelligent, who expanded Stoicism into a full philosophical system, writing hundreds of works that, almost entirely, have been lost to time. What we know of early Stoicism, what scholars call the Old Stoa, we know largely through fragments and second-hand summaries. It is like trying to reconstruct a building from the stones that were salvaged when it was demolished to build something else. You can get a sense of the structure, the proportions, the quality of the materials. But you are always working at one remove from the thing itself. And yet, what survives is enough. More than enough, in fact. Because the later Stoics, the ones who lived under Roman rule, in a world that had absorbed Greek philosophy the way it absorbed Greek art and Greek mathematics, with a practical Roman eye for what actually works, left us texts that are among the most directly useful, most quietly profound pieces of writing in the history of human thought. Those later Stoics are the ones we are going to follow tonight. They are the ones who have spoken most clearly across the centuries, whose words, when you encounter them, have a specific quality of directness that is rare in philosophical writing, a quality of someone speaking not from theory, but from the tested ground of actual experience. Their names are Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus. An emperor, a statesman, a former slave. 3 lives so different in their external circumstances that they might seem to have nothing in common. And yet, reading them in sequence, you encounter something remarkable. The same ideas, approached from different directions, lived out in different bodies under different pressures, arriving at the same essential understanding. As if Stoicism were not a doctrine that these men had adopted, but a geography they had each independently navigated and found to be real. But before we meet them, before we sit with the emperor at his desk before dawn, before we walk with the senator through the corridors of a dangerous court, before we listen to the man who was born in chains speak with a freedom that has nothing to do with where his body could go, we need to understand something about the philosophy itself. Not as a list of principles, not as a set of rules, but as a living structure, a way of seeing the world that, once you begin to understand it, changes the light in which everything else appears. 2. What the Stoics actually believed. There is a version of Stoicism that circulates in the modern world, mostly online, mostly in short quotations set against photographs of mountains or empty roads. It says something like, control what you can control. Let go of what you cannot. Be tough. Feel less. Move forward. This version is not wrong, exactly. It contains something true. But it is the way a photograph of a cathedral contains something true about a cathedral, the outline, the scale, a hint of the light, while leaving out almost everything that makes the building what it is. The people who know Stoicism only in this abbreviated form sometimes sense that something is missing, that the philosophy is being used as a kind of emotional shorthand rather than being understood as the deep and carefully constructed system it actually is. And they are right to sense it. Because underneath the practical advice that modern Stoicism tends to emphasize, there is a complete philosophical picture of the world, an account of what the universe is, what a human being is, and what the relationship between the two makes possible and what it demands. The Stoics divided their philosophy into three parts: logic, physics, ethics, and these three parts were not separate compartments. They were, as Chrysippus described it, like an egg. The shell is logic, the white is physics, and the yolk is ethics. Or, in another image he used, like a living body, the bones and sinews are logic, the flesh is physics, and the soul is ethics. Each part holds the others up. Remove one and the rest collapses. Logic, for the Stoics, was not only formal deduction, not only the structure of arguments and the rules for determining what follows from what. It was also epistemology, the study of how we know things, and it included rhetoric and theory of language. The Stoics were extraordinarily sophisticated about what language does and does not do, about how appearances can mislead us, about the gap between what we perceive and what is actually the case. This concern with clarity, with the discipline of thought, with the question of whether our minds are actually tracking reality, or merely tracking our own projections and assumptions, runs through all of Stoic practice like a thread of fine wire. When Marcus Aurelius, 2,000 years later, sits alone in his tent before a campaign and writes test every impression, that instruction comes directly from this deep Stoic concern with logic, with the honesty of our own perceptual and interpretive apparatus. Physics, and here the word means something much broader than what we mean by it now, was the Stoic account of what the universe is made of and how it works. The Stoics believe that everything that exists is physical. Everything. Even what we would call abstract things, reason, the principle of organization in the universe, what they called the logos, was, for the Stoics, a kind of fine material substance. Not supernatural. Not separate from the physical world. Woven into it, identical with it, the rational structure that matter itself expresses when it unfolds in time. The logos is one of the most important concepts in Stoic thought, and one of the most easily misunderstood. It is sometimes translated as reason, sometimes as word, sometimes as God, and all of these translations are partially right and mostly misleading. The logos, for the Stoics, was the principle by which the universe operates, the intelligence that is the world, expressed in the regularity of seasons and the structure of living things and the path of planets, and the way that fire becomes smoke, becomes cloud, becomes rain, becomes river. The universe, on this account, is not a machine set running by a distant engineer. It is something closer to a living organism, organized from within by a principle of intelligence that pervades it completely. This is why the Stoics spoke of living according to nature as the highest human good. Not nature in the sense of the woods and the rivers, though those have their own beauty. Nature in the sense of the rational structure of things, the logos, of which human reason is a part and an expression. We are, the Stoics said, fragments of the divine fire. The same principle that organizes the universe is present in us, specifically in our capacity for reason, for logos in the small sense, for thought, for reflection, for the ability to step back from an impulse and ask, is this actually what I should do? And this brings us, at last, to ethics, to the question of how to live. The Stoics believed that the only genuine good was virtue, not pleasure, not wealth, not fame, or power, or the admiration of others, not even health, or the survival of the people you love. These things had value. The Stoics were not indifferent to them, not in the way that an extreme asceticism is indifferent, but they were what the Stoics called preferred indifference. Good to have, all else being equal, but not the thing on which your well-being actually depends. Not the foundation. Virtue, and here they meant primarily the four virtues that Plato had described: wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance, was the only thing that was genuinely, unconditionally good. Because it was the only thing fully in your power. Everything else, health, wealth, reputation, the continuation of the things you love, depends on factors outside your control. They can be taken from you by illness, by accident, by the decisions of other people, by the simple indifferent movement of events. But your capacity to respond to events with reason, with justice, with courage, with moderation, that, the Stoics argued, remains yours. Always. Even in extremity. Even in the worst that life can offer. This distinction, between what is in our power and what is not, is so central to Stoicism that it is almost the whole thing, compressed to a seed. Every practice in the Stoic tradition grows from this root. The morning meditation, the evening review of the day, the deliberate imagining of loss before it happens, the calm assessment of what an obstacle actually is and what it is not, all of these return, again and again, to the question, is this mine? Is this within the space where my reason and my will actually operate? Or am I reaching beyond that space, grasping at things that are not mine to hold, and suffering because I cannot hold them? There is something almost paradoxical in the Stoic position, and it is worth sitting with that paradox for a moment rather than smoothing it over. The Stoics were not advising detachment in the sense of not caring about the world. Marcus Aurelius cared enormously about the empire he governed. Seneca loved his friends with a depth that comes through every letter. Epictetus cared about his students with an intensity that is unmistakable in every line of his recorded lectures. The Stoics were not trying to make themselves into people who could not be touched. They were trying to make themselves into people who could be fully present in the world, fully engaged, fully caring, fully committed, without making their inner stability hostage to outcomes they could not guarantee. It is a distinction that is easy to state and enormously difficult to live. Which is, of course, why these three men spent their entire lives writing about it. Now, let us meet them. 3. The philosopher at the edge of the empire. Begin with the emperor. Begin in the dark, before Rome wakes. The year is somewhere around 170 CE. The place is a military camp along the Danube frontier, in the territory that is now Central Europe, Hungary, or Austria, or somewhere in the long borderland where the empire was trying, and largely failing, to hold its position against the pressure of the northern tribes. The camp would have been cold at this hour. Stone and leather and canvas hold heat poorly against the northern winter, and the pre-dawn darkness in that latitude carries a particular stillness, a stillness that is not peaceful, exactly, but merely the suspension of movement, the pause between one kind of effort and the next. In a room somewhere in that camp, a room that was more comfortable than most, but not significantly, because Marcus Aurelius was a man who preferred simplicity in his personal surroundings, a lamp was burning. Oil lamp, probably, with a wick of twisted flax, producing a small, steady, slightly yellowish flame that would have illuminated a circle of maybe 2 or 3 feet of space. A writing tablet. A stylus. And a man, already old by the standards of his time though only in his 50s, bent over the tablet in the lamplight, writing. He was not writing for anyone. That is important. The text that eventually became the Meditations, that book which has been read by soldiers and monks and politicians and artists and prisoners and philosophers for nearly 2,000 years, was not composed as a book. It was not organized for a reader. It was private notes. Personal exercises. A man talking to himself, or rather, a man talking to the part of himself that he was trying to become. Working through the same lessons again and again, returning to the same principles that he kept forgetting and kept needing to remember, in the way that you return to a practice not because you have not understood it, but because understanding is not the same as living it. Marcus Aurelius was born in 121 CE, into a senatorial family with good connections to the imperial court. He was adopted by the Emperor Hadrian's chosen successor, Antoninus Pius, at the age of 17, which meant that from that point on he was being trained not for private life but for the most powerful position in the known world. He received the best education available in the Roman Empire, which in practice meant an education deeply shaped by Greek philosophy, and it was during his teenage years that he first encountered Stoicism. Specifically, he first encountered it through a teacher named Junius Rusticus, who gave him a copy of the lectures of Epictetus, a text we will come to later, but which Marcus would go on to consult for the rest of his life. The gratitude he expresses for that gift, in the opening pages of the Meditations where he lists his teachers and what he received from each, is quiet and specific in a way that suggests something real. Not a courtesy. A record. He became emperor in 161 C, after the death of Antoninus Pius, and he ruled for nearly 20 years. His reign was not a peaceful one. Almost from the beginning, it was defined by crisis, a catastrophic plague that swept through the empire beginning in 165, killing millions, wars on multiple fronts, including the long and grinding campaign against the Marcomanni on the Danube frontier where we find him riding in the dark, political challenges, economic strain, the ordinary, relentless, grinding pressure of trying to govern a vast and complex entity that was already, though no one quite knew it yet, in the early stages of a decline that would take centuries to complete. He also had a private life, which was not uncomplicated. He had a wife, Faustina, whose reputation has been subject to various historical interpretations across the centuries. He had children, many of whom died young, which was the common tragedy of the ancient world but was no less painful for being common. He had a co-emperor, his adoptive brother Lucius Verus, who died in 169 and whose character was the opposite of Marcus's in almost every way, extravagant, pleasure-seeking, beloved by the crowd in ways that the more austere Marcus never quite achieved. And he had, at the end of his life, the deepest private grief of a Stoic emperor, a son, Commodus, who would succeed him, and who would be, to put it gently, something less than his father. Through all of this, the plague, the wars, the deaths, the pressure, the constant performance of public life that required him to be, at all times, the embodiment of imperial authority, Marcus Aurelius wrote in that private notebook. Sometimes brief fragments, aphorisms almost, sometimes longer meditations, working through a problem from multiple angles, testing an idea against the grain of his actual experience. The Greek word he uses for himself in the Meditations, the word he addresses himself with at the beginning of many entries, is a word that means something like soul, or self. He is speaking to himself. Directly, without performance, without the management of appearances that the rest of his day required. And what does he say? He says, again and again, in different ways, in different moods, from different angles, you have today. Only today. What happens outside your will is not yours. The way someone treats you is not yours. Whether the campaign succeeds or fails is not entirely yours. Whether you are loved or despised is not yours. What is yours? The only thing that is fully, inviolably yours, is how you engage with this moment. The quality of your attention. The justice of your actions. The honesty of your thought. You begin to sense, reading the Meditations, the texture of a real struggle. Not a man who has achieved equanimity, and is now dispensing it to others from a position of secure mastery. A man who has to remind himself, every morning, before the day begins, of the things he already knows but keeps forgetting in the friction of living. A man who is genuinely irritated by incompetent courtiers and genuinely tempted by comfort, and genuinely tired of certain recurring problems, and who keeps, quietly, privately, in the lamplight before anyone else is awake, calling himself back. There is an entry in the Meditations that I return to often, not for its specific wording but for its spirit. He writes, in effect, when you wake in the morning and feel reluctance at the prospect of the day, remind yourself that you are waking to the work of a human being, to reason, to action, to engagement with the world. Nature has a work for you to do, just as the sun has a work, and the vine has a work, and the bee has a work. To lie wrapped in warmth is pleasant, but it is not your purpose. Rise, and do what the day requires. He wrote that from a military camp, in the cold, probably having slept badly, probably knowing that the day ahead held nothing he would have chosen for himself. He was reminding himself, with the patient repetition of a teacher who has been through this before and knows that the student needs to hear it again, that the discomfort of the morning is not a reason to remain still. That the gap between what is pleasant and what is required is something that can be crossed. Marcus returned to Epictetus constantly. There are direct allusions throughout the Meditations to the lectures that Rusticus had given him as a young man, and this is one of the beautiful features of Stoicism as a tradition. You can trace the threads. You can see Marcus, in Rome or in the military camp on the Danube, reaching back to a man who had died decades before he was born, a man of unimaginably different circumstances, finding in that man's words something that holds up under the specific weight of his own life. We will come to Epictetus in his own time. But for now, stay with Marcus. Stay with the lamp burning in the camp, the stylus moving across wax, the emperor talking to himself in Greek while somewhere outside the tent the Danube moves in the dark and the frontier waits for morning. There is one more thing to understand about Marcus Aurelius before we move on, and it is not a thing about his philosophy. It is a thing about his character. He was, by almost every account, genuinely good. Not perfect. No one is perfect, and the Stoics themselves were clear that the perfect sage, the absolutely virtuous person who never erred and never was moved by passion and always saw clearly, was more of a theoretical limit than an actually achievable state. Marcus was not that. But he was remarkably, persistently, against the considerable pressure of his position and his power, oriented toward goodness. Oriented toward trying to do what was right rather than what was convenient. And the Meditations are the record of that orientation, not its achievement, but its daily, imperfect renewal. Which is, I think, more useful than perfection would be. Because imperfect and persistent is something you can actually recognize. It is something that looks like a real human life. 4. Letters from the edge of a storm. Now leave the military camp. Leave the cold morning and the oil lamp and the emperor writing to himself in Greek. Travel south and west, back into the warmer heart of the empire, and back in time a little, a century, roughly, to a city that is not a camp but a court, not a frontier but a center, and to a man whose circumstances were, in certain external ways, the opposite of everything the Meditations suggest a Stoic life should look like. Lucius Aeneas Seneca was born sometime around 4 BC in Córdoba, in what is now southern Spain, in a family of the equestrian class with considerable intellectual distinction. His father, whom we call Seneca the Elder, was a rhetorician of great skill, and his nephew would one day be the poet Lucan. Seneca was taken to Rome as a child for his education, and there he encountered Stoicism, studied under several teachers of the school, and developed not only a philosophical sensibility but a political career that would make him one of the most powerful men in the Roman Empire, and ultimately bring him to the end that powerful men in dangerous courts so often came to. He was also enormously wealthy, almost absurdly wealthy, by some accounts. He owned multiple estates, considerable real estate in Rome, and accumulations of silver so impressive that later critics would use them as evidence of his hypocrisy. How can a man who wrote about the unimportance of external goods own so many of them? It is a fair question, and Seneca himself addressed it, with a directness that is one of his most engaging qualities as a writer. But let us not get ahead of ourselves. Let us first establish where Seneca was when he wrote the things we care most about tonight. After a period of considerable influence at court, he had been tutor and then principal advisor to the young Emperor Nero, a role that gave him extraordinary power and that required him to perform the considerable feat of trying to moderate the behavior of a man who was, to understate the matter significantly, difficult. Seneca was eventually pushed out of the court's inner circle. He retired to private life. He was by then in his 60s, a man who had navigated Roman politics for decades, who had been exiled to Corsica by the Emperor Claudius on dubious charges and then recalled, who had watched the court of Nero become something that no Stoic philosopher could comfortably endorse, and who now found himself, for the first time in years, was something that the Marcus Aurelius of the military camps could only have been a fantasy. Time. He spent that time writing. And the most important thing he wrote, The thing that I believe is among the most extraordinary pieces of philosophical correspondence in the history of human thought was a series of letters. 124 of them, addressed to a friend named Lucilius, who was himself a cultivated Roman, a man with literary interests and philosophical curiosity, stationed at the time in Sicily as a provincial administrator. The letters were probably real. Lucilius probably existed and probably received versions of these texts. But they were also, clearly, crafted for a wider readership. They are letters in the way that certain essays are letters, intimate in tone, personal in address, but organized with the care of someone who knows that what he is saying deserves to last. The Epistulae Moralis ad Lucilium, the moral letters to Lucilius. And the first thing Seneca says, in the very first letter, is the thing that sets the tone for everything that follows. He says, "Reclaim your time. Gather it up. Hold on to it. You are losing it," he tells Lucilius, in the way that everyone loses it, in pieces too small to notice, to things that seem to matter in the moment and then, in retrospect, have left no trace. Some of your time is being stolen. Some of it you are carelessly giving away. Some of it, and this is the worst category, is simply slipping through your fingers while you are not paying attention at all. Tempus, the Latin word for time, appears in Seneca's letters with a frequency that would be almost obsessive if it were not so clearly a response to genuine urgency. He was old. He was not certain how much time remained. He had spent decades in a court where the boundary between living well and merely surviving was not always clear, and now, in the clarity of retirement, he was trying to understand and articulate what it meant to use the time that remained as it deserved to be used. This is the question that the moral letters circle around, again and again, from different angles, in different moods. How does a person actually live? Not theoretically, not in the philosopher's ideal case, but in the real pressure of a real life, in a life with money and without money, with power and without it, with health and in illness, with friends and in the particular loneliness that comes when you have been at the center of things and then are no longer there? Seneca's honesty about his own situation is one of the things that makes the letters endure. He does not pretend. When the critics say, "You preach poverty and own estates," he does not dodge the contradiction. He says something closer to this: "I have not yet arrived at the place I am pointing toward. I am walking in that direction." The value of the direction is not negated by the fact that I have not yet reached the destination. You do not discard a map because you have not yet arrived at the place it shows. There is something generous in this admission, and something accurate. The Stoic ideal, perfect virtue, complete inner freedom, total independence of spirit from external circumstance, was acknowledged by the Stoics themselves to be an ideal. A regulative ideal, to use the philosophical term. Something you orient yourself toward, something whose direction organizes your movement, without the pretense that you have already arrived or will certainly arrive. Seneca was not a sage. He said so. He was a person making the effort. Which is, again, something recognizable. Something that does not require you to be exceptional before it applies to you. His letters range widely. He writes about friendship, about what real friendship is, as distinct from the mutual exploitation that often passes for friendship in ambitious social environments. He writes about grief, about what it means to mourn properly, to give grief its due weight without allowing it to become something that you inhabit rather than pass through. He writes about old age, with a candor that becomes more vivid as the letters progress and his own age becomes more pressing. He writes about reading, about how to read, not many books but the right ones deeply, returning to them, letting them work on you over time rather than consuming them and moving on. And there is a letter, one of the most beautiful he wrote, in which he describes the experience of illness as a kind of clarifying pressure, a stripping away of the pretensions of health that returns you to the actual situation of a mortal body navigating time. That situation, Seneca argues, is everyone's actual situation, simply made more visible than usual when you are ill. The illness does not change the fundamental condition. It reveals it. And he writes about death. Frequently. With a directness that a modern reader might find unsettling until they realize that the directness is precisely the thing Seneca is arguing for. To think about death, he argues, not obsessively, not morbidly, but regularly, as part of daily practice, is to think about what life is. It is to look at the time you have from the perspective of its ending, which is the only perspective from which its actual shape becomes clear. We are all, Seneca says, practicing dying. Every day is a rehearsal. The philosopher who has understood this is not afraid of death in the same way, because she has been living as if each day might be complete in itself, as if each day were enough. This practice, this daily orientation toward mortality not as a source of despair but as a clarifying lens, has a Latin name in the Stoic tradition. Memento Mori. Remember that you will die. The phrase has acquired, in modern usage, a certain Gothic quality, a skull and crossbones heaviness that the Stoics would have found puzzling. For them, it was not about darkness. It was about precision. If you remember that your time is limited, you will not waste it. If you remember that the people you love will not always be there, you will not postpone the attention and care you want to give them. If you remember that the things you fear losing, reputation, comfort, security, are already, from the perspective of your eventual death, already lost, then the fear of losing them in this particular way, now, becomes less total, less decisive. There is a connection here to Marcus, sitting at his lamp before the campaign, writing about the impermanence of everything and the smallness of any individual's anxiety against the backdrop of geological time. Both men are doing the same thing from different angles, using the perspective of ending to restore proportion to the present. The emperor in his tent and the retired statesman at his writing table, separated by a century, using the same tool, to the same effect. Seneca wrote one of his most famous letters, Letter 77, about a day when he saw a fleet of ships arriving in the harbor at Puteoli, which was a major port in the Bay of Naples, a few hours south of Rome. The city had turned out to watch, as it always did when the Alexandrian grain fleet arrived. The spectacle was real, huge ships, their sails striking as they entered the harbor itself filling with the particular busyness of arrival. And Seneca watched it with a kind of affectionate detachment. Yes, this is interesting, and I can see why it is interesting, and I can also see that this is not what my afternoon requires. He went back to his books, to his letters, to the work of thinking. What the letter actually argues, in its longer movement, is something about readiness. About living in a state of readiness, not readiness for death specifically, but readiness in the larger sense. The sense of being internally prepared for whatever happens, not through rehearsal of specific scenarios, but through the general cultivation of a spirit that knows what it values and is not confused about where its actual life resides. One more thing about Seneca before we move forward, because it is one of the things about him that seems to me to matter most. He was a stylist of the first order. His prose, even in translation, and the best translations of Seneca are genuinely beautiful, has a quality of compression, an almost epigrammatic density, that was recognized in his own time and has been admired ever since. He writes sentences that feel like they have been heated and forged into their final shape. Sentences that do not expand when you look at them but deepen. This matters philosophically as well as aesthetically, because the compression of his prose is not ornamental. It is functional. He is trying to say things that need to actually lodge in the mind, not be understood once and filed away, but be available, usable, present when needed. Philosophy as medicine, as he himself described it. And medicine needs to be in a form you can actually take. He died in 65 C, ordered to suicide by Nero following a fabricated accusation of involvement in a conspiracy against the emperor's life. The death, according to Tacitus, was slow and painful. The veins he opened did not bleed quickly enough at his age, and he had to be helped further. He spoke throughout, with characteristic composure. Whether this account is entirely accurate or the legendary amplification of a man whose ideas invited such an ending, we cannot know for certain. But it is the kind of death that his philosophy had been rehearsing for years, and there is something fitting, and something terrible, and something deeply human in the fact that the rehearsal and the performance were finally, indistinguishably, the same thing. The man who was not free. Now, a different kind of life entirely. Not the lamp in the imperial tent. Not the letters from the villa in the Bay of Naples. Something else. Something that requires us to adjust the frame through which we have been watching, because the third great Stoic voice of the Roman period arrived at philosophy not from privilege but from the bottom of the Roman social order, from a position that, by the definitions of his world, could not have produced a philosopher at all. Epictetus was a slave. He was born sometime around 50 CE, probably in Hierapolis, a city in what is now western Turkey, and he came to Rome as the property of Epictetus, who was himself a freedman, a former slave, and who served as a secretary and aide to the Emperor Nero. This detail is worth holding for a moment. Epictetus was owned by a man who had himself been owned. He was property in a world where being property was one of the most common conditions of human existence, and where the legal and philosophical consensus held that this condition was natural and appropriate. He was also, and this detail comes to us through a story that may be legendary but feels psychologically true, lame in one leg. The story holds that his master once twisted Epictetus's leg as a demonstration of power, or perhaps as punishment, or perhaps simply as the kind of casual cruelty that people with absolute power over others sometimes perform, and that Epictetus said calmly, "While this was happening, you are going to break it." And when it broke, he said, "Did I not tell you that you would break it?" The story may be embellished, but the principle it illustrates is exactly the principle that defines Epictetus's entire philosophy. The body can be broken. The capacity to respond with reason cannot. One of these is yours. The other is not. At some point, Epictetus was freed. We do not know exactly when or exactly how. We know that after his manumission he studied philosophy in Rome, primarily under a Stoic teacher named Musonius Rufus, a man who had been exiled by Nero and who taught a particularly rigorous, practical version of Stoicism that emphasized action over theory, character over argument. From Musonius, Epictetus received a philosophy that had been thought through the pressure of actual hardship, which is the best possible medium through which to receive it. After the Emperor Domitian expelled philosophers from Rome, probably in 89 or 94 CE, Epictetus moved to Nicopolis, in northwestern Greece, and opened a school there. He taught for decades. He never wrote anything down himself, and this is important, and we should sit with it. The texts we have, the Discourses and the Enchiridion, are the notes of a student. A young man named Arrian, who would go on to be a significant historian in his own right, attended Epictetus's lectures and transcribed them, not as a verbatim record but as an attempt to capture the actual movement and tone and content of what the teacher said. And what Arrian captured has a specific quality that you do not find in Marcus or Seneca. It sounds like a voice. Not the composed, lapidary voice of the Meditations, which is a man's interior monologue, controlled and compressed. Not the careful, stylistically deliberate voice of the letters, which are literary constructions even when they are personally intimate. The voice of the Discourses is the voice of a man talking to students in a room, responding to what they bring, following a line of thought where it goes, sometimes doubling back, sometimes raising his own counter-objections, sometimes speaking with a directness that borders on severity. It is a voice that uses the second person with unusual frequency and unusual intent. Not a rhetorical you, a general you, a you that means people in general. A you that means you, the specific person in the room, the student sitting there with your specific confusions and your specific resistances and your specific habitual ways of avoiding what you know you need to face. What does Epictetus say in that voice? He says, "There are things that are in your power and things that are not in your power." This is not a new idea. We have encountered it already in Marcus, and we will encounter it again. But Epictetus states it with a starkness that takes a moment to absorb. In your power, your opinions, your motivations, your desires, your aversions. Not in your power, your body, your reputation, your property, your position, what other people think of you, what other people do to you. Everything you have been taught to pursue, everything you have been taught to fear, most of it, Epictetus says, is in the second category. Most of the effort and anxiety of the average human life is directed at things that are not in your power. And this is why, he says, you suffer. Not because life is too hard, but because you are pulling against the wrong things. The Greek word he uses for the distinction is prohairesis. It is a difficult word to translate cleanly, and translators have used various English equivalents: will, choice, moral purpose, the ruling faculty. What it points at is something like the seed of rational agency, the part of you that decides, that chooses, that responds. Not reflexively, not automatically, but deliberately. Prohairesis is what Epictetus says is always yours, always free, always sovereign, regardless of what is happening to your body, regardless of what your master does, regardless of what the emperor decrees. The tyrant can imprison your body, Epictetus says. He cannot imprison your prohairesis. He can break your leg. He cannot break your will to respond with reason. This is not a comfortable argument if you are genuinely suffering. Epictetus knew that. He had lived it. And his response to the discomfort of the argument is not to soften it but to be more precise about what it is and is not claiming. It is not claiming that suffering does not hurt. It is not claiming that loss is not real. It is claiming something much more specific, that your evaluation of what happens to you, your judgment about whether a thing is good or bad, bearable or unbearable, that evaluation is in your power. Not the fact. The evaluation of the fact. There is a passage in the Discourses where Epictetus talks about a student who has lost something, a child, perhaps, or a loved one, and is overwhelmed with grief. And Epictetus does not say, "Do not grieve." He says, "Grieve. Let the grief be real." But also notice, in the midst of the grief, that the thing that has been taken from you was always on loan. That you never owned it in the way that you own your own prohairesis. That the person you loved was given to you by the same force that took them back, the same force that gives and takes all things, which is the logos, the rational structure of the universe, that does not organize itself around any individual's attachments, however profound, however deserved. This is a hard thing to hear. I want to say that plainly. It is hard in the way that certain truths are hard, not because they are cruel, but because they require you to see the world at a scale that the scale of personal grief makes almost impossible. But Epictetus believed, and this belief is at the core of his entire teaching, that this scale is actually available to us. That the human capacity for reason includes the capacity to see, at least sometimes, in at least some moments, the larger frame. And that seeing it, even briefly, even partially, is the beginning of something that actually helps. The thread between Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius runs directly and clearly. When the young Marcus received, through Rusticus, those transcribed lectures from the school at Nicopolis, he was receiving something that had been tested in conditions he himself would never face. The conditions of actual ownership, actual physical vulnerability, actual lack of the most basic freedoms that Marcus had always had. And yet the philosophy that had been forged in those conditions applied, completely and practically, to the conditions of imperial life. The slave and the emperor, separated by a century and by the entire spectrum of Roman social possibility, arrived at the same place. The prohairesis is yours. That is the whole of freedom. That is enough. Epictetus died sometime around 135 C. in Nicopolis. He had lived simply, by all accounts, in a house with very little furniture, almost no possessions. His freedom, when it came, had not been followed by the accumulation of things. He had understood, perhaps more directly than anyone, that the accumulation of things was not what freedom was for. Freedom was for this, for the exercise of reason, for the practice of philosophy, for the attempt, imperfect, daily, never fully successful, always worth renewing, to live in a way that kept the prohairesis clear and functioning and genuinely one's own. 6. The discipline of desire. 3 men, then? 3 lives. An emperor riding in the dark before a campaign, a statesman composing letters he knows will outlast him, a former slave speaking in a room in northwestern Greece to students who carry notebooks. 3 different positions in the world, 3 different textures of daily experience, 3 different kinds of pressure. And yet, the same philosophy, worked from the same root. What I want to do now is move more slowly through some of the specific practices that Stoicism produced, the practical techniques, the daily disciplines, the habitual orientations toward the world that together constitute what it actually means to live as a Stoic. Because Stoicism, more than almost any other ancient philosophy, was concerned with practice. Epictetus said it directly: it is not enough to understand the theory. The point of understanding the theory is to change the way you actually live. Philosophy, he said, is not about constructing elegant arguments. It is about learning how to want the right things, fear the right things, and respond to what happens with the faculties that reason provides. The first of these practices, the most fundamental, the one from which everything else in some sense derives, is what the Stoics called the discipline of desire. Or more precisely, the discipline of impulse, the careful attention to what is actually happening in your mind when desire or aversion arises. Most of us, most of the time, experience desire and aversion as facts about the world. We do not experience "I want this" as a description of an internal state that has a particular history and a particular structure and that can, in principle, be examined. We experience it as the world pulling us toward it. The coffee, the approval, the outcome, these feel like they are calling to us from out there. And the discomfort, the fear, the resentment, these feel like they are pressing in from outside. The Stoics argue that this is a confusion. A fundamental, persistent, practically significant confusion. Desire and aversion are events in your mind shaped by your judgments, by your evaluations of what is good and what is bad. And your judgments, your evaluations, these are, in principle, subject to your reason. They are not facts about the world. They are interpretations of the world, and interpretations can be examined, questioned, revised. Marcus Aurelius, in the Meditations, has a remarkable passage, remarkable in its physicality, its willingness to deflate the high style of desire with a kind of deliberate coarseness, where he suggests that when you are tempted by food, or by a beautiful body, or by the allure of reputation, you should describe what the thing actually is, not what your desire makes it appear to be. This wine is fermented grape juice. This body is flesh and bone and the biological processes of a mortal organism. This fame is the noise that people make in response to something you have done, a noise that will die with the people who make it and with you. The exercise is not cynical, or rather, it is not intended to be cynical. It is intended to restore proportion, to allow you to want or not want the thing from a position of clear seeing, rather than from the fog of projection and fantasy that desire generates around its object. The Stoics had a specific term for the tendency to allow desire to distort our perception of what is actually good. They called it a passion, in the technical sense, pathos in Greek. A passion, in Stoic terminology, is not simply a strong feeling. It is a feeling that arises from a false judgment about the value of something. Fear of death, strictly speaking, is irrational, not in the sense of being without psychological explanation, but in the sense that it rests on the judgment that death is a genuine evil, which the Stoics disputed. Grief that becomes consuming and endless is not simply a response to loss. It is a response to loss compounded by the judgment that what has been lost was necessary for one's well-being. The remedy is not to suppress the feeling, but to examine the judgment. To look clearly at what the feeling rests on. And then to decide, with the full faculty of reason rather than the compressed urgency of passion, whether the judgment actually holds. This sounds, described abstractly, like a cold process. And there is a version of it that is cold, a version that mistakes detachment for equanimity, that suppresses rather than examines, that uses philosophical language as a kind of emotional armor rather than a tool for genuine clarity. The Stoics were aware of this risk. Seneca, in particular, warns against it with characteristic directness. Philosophy is not a costume, he says, essentially. You do not put it on to impress people or to avoid feeling. You practice it in order to feel more accurately, to desire more wisely, to be moved by the things that genuinely deserve to move you and not by the things that only appear to deserve it. Epictetus makes the same point from his particular vantage. He does not say, become someone who does not feel. He says, become someone who does not mistake the feeling for a verdict about reality. The feeling of fear does not prove that the thing feared is genuinely dangerous. The feeling of desire does not prove that the thing desired is genuinely good. These are propositions to be examined, not conclusions to be accepted. And the examination, the quiet, honest, regular examination of what your feelings are actually resting on, is what the discipline of desire, practiced over time, actually produces. What does this mean in practice? It means that when you feel irritated by something someone has said, the Stoic practice is not to suppress the irritation but to ask, what is this irritation resting on? What judgment does it express? Is that judgment accurate? Was the person actually trying to harm you, or were they doing something that had nothing to do with you, something that your self-regard is interpreting as an attack? When you feel anxious about an outcome, the Stoic practice is not to tell yourself to calm down but to ask, what am I judging to depend on this outcome? Is that judgment accurate? Is my well-being actually conditional on this thing, or am I adding that conditionality from inside my own mind? These questions, practiced over time, do something. Not immediately. Not perfectly. Not in a way that removes the initial surge of feeling, because the initial surge of feeling is biological and fast and does not wait for philosophical deliberation. But practiced over time, they change the second movement, the elaboration of the initial feeling into a sustained emotional state. The anger that lasts for days. The anxiety that becomes background noise. These second movement states are where the Stoic disciplines actually intervene, and where the distinction between the initial feeling and the sustained evaluation becomes practically significant. 7. Premeditatio Malorum, the art of the imagined worst. There is a practice in Stoicism that modern positive thinking culture would find almost perverse, and that I want to describe carefully, because it is one of the most useful things the Stoics developed and also one of the most easily misunderstood. The practice is called Premeditatio Malorum, the premeditation of evils, or, less dramatically, the deliberate imagining, in advance, of what could go wrong. Not as a form of worry. Not as a way of spiraling into anxiety. As a deliberate exercise practiced calmly, from a position of stability, with the specific purpose of reducing the power that imagined losses have over you. The logic is this. Fear of loss, Seneca argued, is often worse than the loss itself. This is not a consolation, it is an observation about the structure of anticipatory dread. When we do not think about the possibility of losing something we love, we become anxious in a diffuse way. The anxiety lives in the body without being examined, without being met directly, showing up as irritability or restlessness or a vague background feeling of dread that colors everything without being named. When we do think about it, when we sit with the possibility of losing a friendship, or a health, or a position we have worked toward, when we actually follow that thought to its consequences and ask, and then what? We often find that the territory beyond the feared loss is not as featureless as the fear made it seem. There is still something there. There is still the capacity for reason. There is still the possibility of living in a way that is worth living. Seneca recommended the practice of occasionally imagining poverty, actually picturing, with some specificity, what it would mean to live with significantly less than you currently have. Not as a form of punishment, not as a way of making yourself feel guilty for having more. As a way of testing whether your attachment to your current level of comfort is actually as necessary as it feels. He tried it himself, apparently. He spent a day or several days eating the food of the poor and sleeping on a rough mat. And he found, as he reports in one of the letters, that the thing was not as terrible as the idea of it. That a person can live at that level. Not comfortably, but livably. And that knowing this is useful. It means that the fear of poverty no longer has the same quality of absolute threat. Marcus Aurelius, in the Meditations, practices a version of this that is more philosophical and more abstract. He contemplates the impermanence of everything, the empires that have passed, the famous names that are no longer remembered, the generations of people who were absolutely certain that what they were doing mattered, whose certainty has been dissolved by time. He is not wallowing in this. He is using it. He is placing his own anxieties, his own fears about the fate of the empire or his own reputation or his own legacy, within a frame large enough that they reveal their actual proportions. And Epictetus approaches premeditatio from the angle of attachment. He suggests, in a passage that can feel harsh until you understand what it is doing, That when you embrace your child or your friend or your partner, you should hold in mind, at least briefly, the fact that this person is mortal. Not to diminish the embrace. Not to introduce distance into love. To make the love more honest. To allow the love to include the fact of its own contingency, so that the contingency does not come as a shock when it arrives, does not devastate in the same way that a thing you were absolutely unprepared for devastates. There is a concept in modern psychology that the Stoics did not have but whose content they described thoroughly: negative visualization. Research on it suggests something that the Stoics argued from first principles, that occasionally imagining the loss of things we value actually increases our appreciation of those things in the present. Not through any clever psychological trick, but through the simple mechanism of attention. When you have thought, even briefly, about the possibility that you will not always have this person, this health, this time of life, this particular morning with its particular quality of light, the having of it, while you have it, becomes more vivid, more present, more genuinely appreciated. The Stoics were not pessimists. I want to be clear about that, because the Premeditatio can make them sound like they were in love with the worst-case scenario. They were realists in a specific sense. They believed that the world as it actually is, impermanent, uncontrollable, sometimes cruel, sometimes beautiful, is a better home for the human spirit than the world as we would like it to be. Because the world as we would like it to be requires constant maintenance, constant anxiety, constant vigilance against the intrusion of the actual. And that maintenance is exhausting, and it fails, and when it fails we are devastated in proportion to how long we sustain the fantasy. The world as it actually is can be lived in, can be loved, can be met with something that the Stoics called, in their careful way, equanimity, which is not the absence of feeling, but feeling that has found its proper proportion. 8. Amor Fati, the love of what is. There is a phrase that Nietzsche coined, in the 19th century, to describe something he found in Stoic thought and wanted to amplify: Amor Fati, the love of fate. Not the acceptance of fate, not the resigned, gritted-teeth endurance of what cannot be changed. The love of it. The active affirmation of everything that happens, not because everything is good, but because what happens is what is, and what is the only possible ground for everything that might yet be. Marcus Aurelius does not use this exact phrase, it belongs to a later philosophical vocabulary, but the concept runs through the Meditations so persistently that it amounts to a structural principle. Again and again, in different formulations, he returns to the same basic movement: this is what happened. Not this is what I wanted to happen, or what I planned for, or what seems fair given my effort and intentions. This is what happened. And the question is not, why did this happen to me? The question is, how do I engage with what is actually in front of me, now? There is a famous passage in which Marcus imagines obstacles as things that provide the material for virtue, rather than things that prevent it. The thing that blocks your path, he says, becomes the path. The impediment to action is itself the action. The fire that is fed by obstacles becomes stronger, not weaker. What is given to you to work with, even the hard things, even the things that seem like they are working against you, is what you have to work with. And the Stoic is the person who has practiced seeing that material clearly and using it fully. This is not a philosophy of passive acceptance. It is, in a particular sense, a philosophy of radical engagement. Because if you have accepted, genuinely accepted, not merely said the words but inhabited the acceptance, that you cannot control outcomes, only your response to them, then you are freed from the enormous energy expenditure of resisting reality. And that energy goes somewhere. It goes into the quality of the response itself, into the care with which you act, and the clarity with which you see, and the justice with which you treat the people around you. Seneca describes this in a letter where he talks about the difference between a person who is driven by winds and a person who rows. The person who is driven by winds goes where the wind goes. This is the person who is at the mercy of circumstance, who moves quickly when things are favorable and is immobilized when they are not, whose direction is a function of external forces rather than internal choice. The person who rows goes where they choose to go, more slowly, perhaps, more effortfully, but the direction is theirs. The effort is theirs. And in the effort, there is a kind of satisfaction that the wind-driven traveler never knows, because the wind-driven traveler is never really present in the journey. The destination arrives, or it does not, and either way the traveling was not really hers. Amor Fati in this Stoic understanding is not about pretending that everything is good. Seneca did not pretend that Nero's court was good. Marcus did not pretend that the plague was good. Epictetus did not pretend that slavery was good. They were not cheerful deniers of suffering. They were people who had looked at the structure of human suffering carefully enough to identify what part of it was modifiable, the part that comes from our judgments, our attachments, our resistance to the actual, and who had practiced, with varying degrees of success, the modification of exactly that part. This distinction, between the suffering that comes from the fact and the suffering that comes from our relationship to the fact, is not something the Stoics invented. You can find versions of it in Buddhism, in certain strands of Judaic thought, in elements of Taoism. It seems to be something that sufficiently careful contemplative traditions arrive at independently, because it is something that patient observation of the human mind actually reveals. The fact hurts often. But the fact compounded by resistance, by the insistence that it should not be, by the constant internal rerunning of what might have been, that compounded suffering is much larger, much more exhausting, and much more subject to modification. 9. The view from above. One of the meditation practices that appears in multiple Stoic texts, and that I find particularly beautiful in the way it works on the imagination, is what scholars sometimes call the view from above. It is a kind of deliberate perceptual exercise, not a philosophical argument but a shift of perspective, an imaginary elevation, that allows you to see your current situation against a background large enough to reveal its actual proportions. Marcus Aurelius describes it most vividly. He imagines viewing human affairs from a great height, from the perspective of a bird, or a planet, or simply from very far above the immediate situation. And from that height, the things that seemed large, the insult that was delivered this morning, the plan that has been frustrated, the anxiety about a particular outcome, shrink to their actual size. Not to nothing. Not to irrelevance. But to the size they actually are in the larger pattern of things. He does this not to dismiss what matters. He does it to recalibrate. To restore proportion after proportion has been distorted by the close pressure of the immediate. And then, having seen things in proportion, to return to the ground and act, with the clarity that the elevated view provides, but with the full engagement of someone who knows that the ground is where the actual work is done. There is something in this practice that I think is genuinely useful for people who find themselves lying awake at night with something pressing on them. Whatever is pressing on you, and I have no idea what it is, because I do not know you, and you may be carrying something very specific and very heavy. Whatever it is, there is a version of the view from above that applies to it. Not to make it small. To see it in its actual context. To see that you are one person, in one moment, of a long human story that has absorbed many pressures and many griefs and many nights like this one. Marcus, in the Meditations, asks himself repeatedly, what is this, really? When he is irritated, when he is anxious, when he is tempted by comfort or distracted by flattery, he asks, what is this, actually? Described without the distortion of desire or fear, what is the actual substance of this situation? And the asking, the careful asking, is itself a practice. Not always answered completely. Not always leading to resolution. But the habit of asking, over a lifetime, changes the quality of one's relationship to experience in ways that accumulate, quietly and significantly, over time. Seneca approaches the same practice through memory and history. He places himself in conversation, imagined but real enough for his purposes, with Socrates, with Zeno, with Cato, men who faced worse and responded with greater clarity. He does not do this to diminish his own difficulties by comparison. He does it to locate himself in a tradition, to feel the weight of that tradition behind him, to know that what he is trying to do has been tried before and has been worth trying, that the path has been walked even if it is overgrown and requires clearing again with each new set of feet. And Epictetus does something different again. He locates the view from above not in historical comparison but in the concept of the logos, the rational structure of the universe of which each individual reason is a fragment. When Epictetus invites you to see your situation from a larger perspective, he is inviting you to see it from the perspective of reason itself, which is the perspective of the whole. Not your reason, your individual, partial, passion-colored reason, but reason as it would operate if it were fully itself, patient, comprehensive, unclouded by the urgency of the immediate. This is what the Stoics called living according to nature. Not living simply, not living without technology or civilization, but living according to the rational structure that nature expresses, and that the human mind, at its best, participates in. The view from above is, in this sense, the view from nature itself. From the organizing principle that includes your situation, your anxiety, your hope, and everything else, and that is not disturbed by any of it. This is one of the gifts that philosophy offers, when it is alive rather than academic, the sense of being in conversation with minds that have been where you are and have thought carefully about it. Not minds that have solved it. There is no final solution to the condition of being human, no formula that, once found, removes the difficulty. But minds that have looked at it honestly, and that their honesty survives in the record, and that you can reach it at any hour. Including this one. X. On anger, and what it actually is. There is a text by Seneca that is not one of the letters, that is not so often cited in the popular Stoicism that circulates widely, but that seems to me to be one of the most practically useful things he ever wrote. It is a treatise on anger. De ira. On anger. It is 3 books long. And it begins with a question that might seem simple but that Seneca takes seriously enough to spend 3 books answering. What is anger, and what should be done about it? His answer is characteristically precise. Anger, he argues, is always about something that we believe should not have happened, a violation of what we expected, what we felt entitled to, what we judge to be right and have not received. It is, in that sense, always about a judgment. Someone treated you with disrespect, and you believe you deserved respect. Someone failed to deliver what was promised, and you believe the promise was binding. Someone acted in a way that contradicted your understanding of how the world should work. The Stoic approach to anger is not to suppress it. Seneca is explicit about this. Suppressed anger does not go away, it metabolizes into something worse, something that shows up as resentment, or contempt, or a low-level, persistent hostility that poisons relationships without ever appearing as the anger it actually is. The approach is to examine it. To ask, what is the judgment underneath this? Is the judgment accurate? Was I actually wrong, or did I simply not get what I wanted? And if I was actually wrong, if someone did something genuinely unjust, what is the most useful response, the one most likely to actually change the situation, rather than simply the one that the anger in its initial surge is insisting upon? Marcus Aurelius returns to anger frequently in the Meditations, and his treatment of it has a quality of personal recognition, the quality of someone who knows the feeling from the inside and is working to understand it from the outside at the same time. He is particularly attentive to the anger that arises in response to other people's failures and limitations. When people disappoint him, when advisors are foolish, when subordinates are careless, when people who should know better do not act as though they know better, he feels something, and he keeps examining what he feels. His response, developed over years of practice, is something close to this: people do what makes sense to them, according to their lights. Their lights are often dim, but that is not a fact about their wickedness. It is a fact about their formation, their understanding, the particular intersection of circumstance that has made them who they are. To be angry at a person for being limited is like being angry at a wall for being in the way. The wall is where it is. The person is who they are. The useful response is not anger. It is clear-eyed, matter-of-fact, compassionate management of the actual situation. This does not mean passive acceptance of wrongdoing. Marcus, as emperor, corrected, removed, and penalized people who did serious harm. He was not confusing equanimity with permissiveness. He was simply trying to respond to wrongdoing from a position of clear reason rather than from the hot blur of anger, which makes decisions worse, not better, and which costs the person feeling it more than it costs the person it is aimed at. Seneca makes this last point with particular force. Anger damages the person who feels it more reliably than it damages the person it is directed at. It disturbs sleep, disrupts health, distorts judgment, creates enemies, breaks relationships, and leaves behind it a residue of shame, because anger, when it is over, usually reveals in retrospect that something was exaggerated, that the response was larger than the provocation warranted, that the dignity you were trying to defend has, in the heat of the defense, been compromised by the defense itself. The Stoic practice is not to become someone who does not feel anger. It is to develop the capacity to feel the first movement of anger, the initial surge that is biological and fast, without immediately converting it into the second movement, the elaborated response that involves accusations and demands and the hardening of positions. There is a pause, the Stoics argued, between the first movement and the second. It is a small pause sometimes. It can be very small. But it exists, and in that pause, reason is available. And if you have practiced enough, if the habit of pausing and asking has been practiced enough that it is available even in the heat of the moment, then the second movement can be guided by something other than the first movement's momentum. Both Marcus and Epictetus return to the same image separately, the pause between stimulus and response. The moment in which you could react automatically, or could respond deliberately. The Stoic practice is to extend that moment. To find it, to enter it, to use it. Not every time, not perfectly, not in the acute conditions of extreme provocation. But in the ordinary daily friction of life with other people, the small frustrations, the minor disappointments, the recurring patterns of behavior from people we know well, in that ordinary territory, the practice works. And the cumulative effect of it, over years, is something that the people around you notice. Not because you have become someone who does not respond. Because you have become someone whose response is consistently measured, consistently in proportion to what actually happened rather than to what the first feeling said happened. 11. Friendship, and the good use of other people. Let me tell you something that is sometimes lost in the popular presentation of Stoicism, which tends to emphasize self-sufficiency, the inner life, the independence of the individual from external circumstance. The Stoics cared about other people. Deeply. They developed a sophisticated account of how human beings are connected to one another, and what those connections require, and what they make possible. The key concept is what the Stoics called kiosis, a Greek word that is usually translated as appropriation, or affiliation, or belonging, but that means something closer to the process by which we come to recognize something as our own, as belonging to the same circle of concern as our own life. The process begins, the Stoics argued, with the self. The newborn animal cares first for its own survival, its own immediate experience. But it does not remain there. Through development, through relationship, through the natural expansion of what the rational animal is capable of perceiving and caring about, the circle of ekiosis expands. To family, to community, to city, to humanity as a whole. This is the Stoic basis for what they called cosmopolitanism, the idea, radical in its time and not uncontroversial in ours, that the primary community to which a human being belongs is not their city, or their nation, or their ethnic group, but humanity itself. The world is a single city, the Stoics said, and we are all citizens of it. Marcus Aurelius writes about this with an insistence that has the quality of someone talking himself into something he keeps forgetting. We were made for each other, he says essentially. The rational animal is a social animal. A human being who treats other human beings primarily as obstacles or instruments is failing to live in accordance with its own nature. The part of you that is rational, the part that shares in the logos, is the part that connects you to other rational beings. Reason is not private. It is, by its nature, shared. Seneca, in the Letters, develops this through his treatment of friendship. His account of friendship is one of the most beautiful things in his writing, careful, honest, and deeply felt in a way that goes beyond philosophical argument into something that reads like personal testimony. He writes that the purpose of making a friend is not to have someone who will help you when you need it. That is a transactional relationship, not a friendship. The purpose of making a friend is to have someone to whom you can reveal yourself completely, someone in whose presence the performance of social life can be set down, someone who knows the distance between the face you present to the world and the face that actually looks out from behind it, and who does not prefer the public face. He also writes, in a letter whose emotional directness is striking even by his standards, about the death of a friend. About what it means to lose someone whose presence in your life has been one of the things that made your life feel coherent and valued. And his treatment of this grief is characteristically both honest and instructive. Grieve, he says, in effect. Let the grief be real. But notice, the thing that has been lost is the external form of the relationship, the person's presence, the voice, the specific material reality of them. What you gained from the friendship, what it made you, how it shaped your thinking, the parts of yourself that came alive in the presence of that person, these are not gone. They are yours. They live in you, and in the way that you carry what that person gave you, and in the way that you, in turn, give it to others. This is a real consolation, not a rhetorical one. It describes something that people who have loved and lost often recognize, that the dead continue, not in any supernatural sense, but in the specific sense that their influence persists in the living, shapes the living, continues to act in the world through the living. The way to honor what you have lost is to carry it forward faithfully. To allow the love and the attention and the ways of seeing that the relationship produced to continue functioning in you, in what you do and how you think and who you become. Epictetus's account of human relationship is sharper in its edges. He had more occasion to understand the ways in which attachment to other people can be used as a lever of control, but it is not colder. His argument is not that you should love people less. It is that you should love them without making your inner stability conditional on their behavior, their safety, their continued existence. Not because they do not matter, but because making your stability hostage to their contingency serves either you nor them. A person whose peace depends on the behavior of another person is perpetually anxious, perpetually vigilant, perpetually disappointed, and this vigilance and disappointment become, over time, a weight on the relationship itself, a demand that the relationship bear a burden it is not designed to bear. The Stoic ideal of relationship is full engagement without dependency. Love the people in your life fully. Care about them deeply. Be genuinely present with them. And do all of this without requiring them to stay, to succeed, to behave according to your preferences, to be what you need them to be. It is not achieved easily. But the direction of travel it describes, toward love that does not grasp, toward care that does not control, toward presence that does not demand, is a direction that most of us recognize as genuinely better, even when we cannot fully walk it. 12. The body, and what it is for. The Stoics had a complicated relationship with the body. Not complicated in the way of modern ambivalence, the conflicted feelings about physical appearance, the anxiety about health and aging, the cultural noise about what the body should look like and what it should be able to do. Complicated in a more fundamental philosophical sense. They were either body haters who saw the physical as an obstacle to the spiritual, nor simple physicalists who thought the body was the whole of what you were. They occupied a careful middle position. The body, in Stoic thought, was a preferred indifferent. Good to have, in good health, in reasonable condition. This is better than the alternative, and the Stoics were not ascetics who believed that physical suffering was spiritually productive. But the body was not the self. The body was the instrument through which the self operated in the world, and the instrument deserved reasonable care, but deserved it in the way that a craftsman cares for his tools, not because the tools are the craft, but because without them the craft cannot proceed. Marcus Aurelius, who spent much of his adult life in poor health, he seems to have had some kind of chronic digestive condition, and the physical demands of military campaigning in middle age were significant, returns repeatedly to the body's limitations without either dwelling on them resentfully or pretending they do not exist. He notes them. He works around them. He treats physical discomfort as one of the many things that can be processed by the discipline of the judgment, not by pretending the discomfort is not there, but by not allowing the discomfort to become, in the mind, larger than it actually is. The body hurts. That is the body's information. It is not necessarily a verdict about the quality of the day or the worth of the effort. Seneca, who was himself frequently ill, His letters mention what sounds like a recurring respiratory condition, as well as other ailments, writes about illness with a surprising interest. He finds, in illness, a kind of clarifying pressure. When you are ill enough to be uncertain about the future, you discover, usually, that the things you were most anxious about in health are not the things you care about in illness. The pending decisions, the professional worries, the accumulated concerns about reputation, these tend to go quiet. What remains tends to be simpler: the quality of the light in the room, the people who come to see you, the sense of whether you have done the things that matter to you, said the things that needed to be said. Epictetus approached the body from the angle of what it is not. It is not you. Your body can be imprisoned. Your body can be sick. Your body can be owned, as his was. But your prohairesis, your rational faculty, your capacity to respond with reason to what happens, that is not your body. It is the thing that is aware of the body, that observes it, that can, in principle, assess it clearly rather than simply being driven by it. For most of us, on most days, the relevance of this is not dramatic. We are not slaves. We are not, most of the time, in conditions of extreme physical coercion. But we are all subject to the body's moods and hungers and discomforts and limitations, and we are all, at some level, at the mercy of those conditions, exhausted when we are tired, irritable when we are hungry, anxious when we are in pain. The Stoic practice does not claim to remove these conditions. It claims to create a small but real space between the condition and the response. A space in which reason is available. A space in which the body's current state informs but does not dictate. That space, small as it is where a great deal of the quality of a life is actually determined. 13. Virtue as the only good, the radical claim. We have been circling around it all night, and now we should meet it directly. The Stoic claim that virtue is the only genuine good. Not a good among other goods, not the best among several candidates. The only genuine good. Everything else, health, wealth, reputation, pleasure, the survival of those you love, is, strictly speaking, either good nor bad. It is what the Stoics called Aphelion. Indifferent. This claim is, I think, the place where most modern readers feel the sharpest resistance. And the resistance is reasonable. It feels inhuman, in some sense, to say that the death of a child is not a genuine evil, that poverty is not a genuine bad, that the suffering of innocent people is not, in some deep and real sense, wrong. These things feel not merely unfortunate but objectively, seriously, irredeemably bad. And a philosophy that says otherwise seems to be making an error, or performing a kind of emotional amputation, or both. But the Stoic position is more careful than the quick summary makes it appear, and it is worth understanding it precisely before dismissing it. The Stoics did not say that preferred indifference did not matter. They did not say that you should be indifferent, in the ordinary emotional sense, to whether your child lives or dies, or whether your city is destroyed, or whether the people you love are suffering. They said that these things are not genuinely, unconditionally good or bad, because genuine good, in their technical sense, had to be unconditional, had to be something that was always good regardless of circumstances, always worth having regardless of what else was true. Pleasure, for example, fails this test. Pleasure is generally preferred, but it is not always good. The pleasure of a cruel person in another's suffering is not good. The pleasure that comes from something that will later cause harm is not unconditionally good. Health is generally preferred, but the health of a tyrant who uses it to oppress people is not straightforwardly good for the world. The things that are conditionally valuable, valuable in most circumstances, valuable all else being equal, are not the same as things that are unconditionally valuable. Virtue, acting well, according to reason and justice and wisdom and courage, passes the test. It is always good, in every circumstance, in every condition. A poor person can be virtuous. A sick person can be virtuous. A person in chains can be virtuous. Epictetus was the living demonstration of this. The virtue is not contingent on external conditions in the way that health and wealth and pleasure are contingent on external conditions. It is available, always, as long as the capacity for reason remains. This is what Marcus Aurelius keeps writing toward, in the Meditations. Not that the difficulties he faces do not matter. They clearly do. The plague matters enormously. The frontier campaign is the work that occupies most of the last decade of his life. The loss of children is a grief that shows up in the text, honestly and without resolution. But beneath all of this, beneath the legitimate maturing of all of these things, there is the question of what kind of person he will be in the face of them. And that question, about the quality of his response, the justice of his actions, the integrity of his reasoning, that question is where his actual life is. That is the thing that is his. The practical implication of this is not indifference. It is a reordering of priorities that is, in the long run, profoundly stabilizing. If your well-being genuinely depends on your virtue, on the quality of your own character and action, then your well-being is not hostage to what happens outside of you. It is not destroyed by misfortune. It is not removed by illness. It is not taken from you by the loss of position or reputation or the approval of others. You still have the thing that actually matters. You still have the ground beneath you. This is not a consolation for the loss of other things. It is meant to point to something that remains when everything else has been stripped away, something that is actually there, actually reliable, actually yours. And to suggest that orienting your life around that thing, rather than around the things that can be stripped away, is both more honest and more, in the deepest sense, safe. 14. The Evening Review. There is a practice attributed to the Stoics, described by Seneca with particular clarity and warmth, that I want to describe as we move toward the later part of this night. It is a practice of review, of the day just past, undertaken in the quiet of the evening, when the activity of the day has settled and the mind is still enough to look back at what happened with something approaching clarity. Seneca describes it as a nightly habit. Before sleep, he says, he passes the day in review. He asks himself, what have I done well today? What have I done badly? What could I have done better? Not as self-flagellation, he is explicit about this. The review is conducted without anger, without harsh judgment, more in the spirit of a teacher reviewing a student's work than a prosecutor reviewing evidence. The point is not punishment. The point is learning. The point is the slow accumulation, day by day, of a more accurate and more honest understanding of the gap between the person you are and the person you are trying to be. 3 questions, essentially. Did I do harm today? Did I miss an opportunity to do good? Where was my reason obscured by passion, by anger, by desire, by fear, in a way that led to something I regret? And then, having asked the questions and received whatever answers the honesty of the moment provides, you set the day down. You do not carry it forward into tomorrow. The review is not a way of prolonging the day's anxieties into the night. It is a way of closing the day, of extracting from it what can be learned, and releasing the rest. The rest is over. Tomorrow is its own day, and whatever it requires will be addressed by the self that is rested and renewed by sleep, not by the self that has been lying awake replaying what is already done. Marcus Aurelius does something similar in the Meditations, though in a less systematized way. Many of the entries have the quality of post hoc review, a man looking at something that happened, or something he felt, or something someone did, and trying to understand it more clearly than he did in the moment. The Meditations are, among other things, a record of an ongoing, lifelong practice of self-examination, not the brutal self-examination of someone who cannot forgive himself, but the patient, persistent self-examination of someone who genuinely wants to improve and who has enough self-respect to believe that improvement is possible. What both of them seem to have understood, and what the practice of evening review eventually teaches everyone who undertakes it seriously, is that the day is a natural unit of human experience, small enough to hold in the mind, large enough to contain something complete. Things begin in the day. Things are attempted. Things succeed, things fail, things produce unexpected results. Relationships move, sometimes forward and sometimes back. Intentions meet circumstances and are modified by them. And in the evening, when the day is over, there is a moment, if you take it, in which all of this can be seen together, from the slight elevation that a few hours of distance provides, and in which the pattern of it can be understood a little more clearly than it was while you were inside it. The practice of review is a practice of seeing. of actually looking at what happened, rather than only feeling what happened. It does not require perfect recall. It does not require a journal, though a journal can be useful. It requires only a few minutes of genuine attention to the day that has just passed, to the person you were in it, to the ways in which you were the person you want to be and the ways in which you were not. And then rest. The day has been seen. It has been acknowledged. It does not require anything more from you tonight. Whatever needs to be done with it, whatever needs to be carried forward, whatever needs to be revised, whatever needs to be continued tomorrow, that can be addressed tomorrow, by the self that sleep will return to you. Sleep is not, in the Stoic view, an interruption of the philosophical life. It is part of it. The body that houses the rational faculty needs restoration. The mind that has been at work needs silence. Even Marcus Aurelius, who noted his own reluctance to leave the warmth of bed, understood this. The morning that the philosophy requires must come from somewhere. It comes from the night. It comes from this. 15. Cleanthes, hierarchals, and the larger tradition. Before we arrive at the end of tonight's journey, I want to stay for a moment with the tradition itself, with the wider circle of Stoic thought that surrounds our three central figures, because Stoicism was not invented by Marcus Aurelius, and it did not end with Epictetus. It was a living, developing tradition, and some of what was developed in its earlier and later reaches has a beauty that deserves to be mentioned. Cleanthes of Assos was the second head of the Stoic school, the man who succeeded Zeno of Citium and held the porch together until the formidable intellect of Chrysippus could take it further. By ancient accounts, Cleanthes was not a brilliant systematic thinker in the way Chrysippus was. He was something else, a man of great steadiness, great personal integrity, a man who worked as a water carrier by night to earn enough to study philosophy by day, and who kept working at ideas slowly and carefully over decades rather than producing the rapid output that characterized Chrysippus. What survives of his work is almost entirely fragmentary, except for one remarkable thing, a poem. The Hymn to Zeus. It is one of the very few complete texts from the early Stoic period, and it is, in its way, one of the most beautiful things that Greek philosophy produced. The Hymn to Zeus is not really about Zeus in the way that Homeric hymns are about gods. It is about the Logos, the rational principle of the universe, addressed in personal terms, in the way that you might address something that is simultaneously vast and intimate, simultaneously the structure of everything and the ground of your own being. The hymn celebrates the Logos as the organizing principle of the cosmos, the force by which even what seems chaotic or disordered is, in the larger view, part of a pattern that reason can perceive. It describes human beings as fragments of the divine fire, a phrase that Marcus Aurelius would use again, 2.5 centuries later, who are capable of understanding and participating in the rational structure of things, if they choose to, if they practice. The poem has a quality of genuine feeling that is unusual in ancient philosophical writing, and that survives even in translation. It is not arguing. It is not explaining. It is doing something closer to what poetry does when it is working. It is making the abstract vivid, making the large intimate, making the impersonal personal. Cleanthes was not the most systematic of the Stoics. He may have been the most genuinely moved by what he believed. Then there is Hierocles, who lived in the 2nd century CE, contemporary with Marcus Aurelius, a figure who wrote about Stoic ethics with a clarity and practical elegance that his contemporaries clearly valued. His account of achiosis, the concentric circles of human concern and connection, is one of the most useful things in the entire Stoic corpus. He described the circles in spatial terms. Imagine, he said, a series of rings centered on yourself. The innermost ring is your own body and your own reason. The next ring is your immediate family. The next is extended family. Then neighbors and acquaintances, then fellow citizens, then members of your nation, and finally, in the outermost ring, all of humanity. The ethical task, Hierocles argued, is to draw each outer ring closer toward the center. Not to dissolve the difference between your care for yourself and your care for a stranger. That distinction is real, and Hierocles was not pretending it wasn't. But to actively cultivate the extension of concern, to practice treating those in the outer rings with something more like the consideration you naturally give to those in the inner rings. To remember, when dealing with someone far from you in any ordinary sense, that they are still in your ring. That they still share the logos. That they are, in the most fundamental sense, your kind. This is the philosophical ground from which the Roman concept of humanitas grew, the idea that there is something specific to being human that creates obligations across all the distinctions of status and culture and geography that divide humans from one another. Cicero had it before Hierocles, but Hierocles articulated it with a precision that Cicero did not achieve. And in Marcus Aurelius, who read these ideas and tried to govern an empire according to them, you see what it looks like when someone actually attempts to live at the outer rings, to treat the barbarians on the frontier not as enemies to be destroyed but as human beings to be managed as justly as the situation allows, to see even the people he found most difficult as participants in the same rational community. It did not always work. Power is not philosophy, and the pressures of governing an empire have their own logic that does not wait for philosophical deliberation. But the attempt was real, and the record of it, in the Meditations, in the historical accounts of his reign, is the record of something genuine. Of a person trying to live at the outer ring of Hierocles' circles, in the conditions where doing so was hardest. And then, beyond the Roman period, Stoicism flows forward in unexpected ways. The early Christian writers absorbed a great deal of Stoic vocabulary and Stoic ethics. The emphasis on virtue, on inner freedom, on the cosmopolitan brotherhood of all rational beings, on the sovereignty of reason over passion. The medieval scholastics encountered Stoic ideas through Cicero and through the Christian writers who had absorbed them. The Renaissance rediscovered Seneca and Marcus directly. Montaigne built his entire philosophical project in conversation with Seneca's letters. Descartes was shaped by Stoic logic and Stoic epistemology in ways he did not always acknowledge. And in the 17th century, a Dutch philosopher named Baruch Spinoza developed an account of the universe, organized by a single rational principle, of which all finite things are expressions, in which human freedom consists not in escape from nature's laws but in understanding and aligning with them, that is, in its deep structure, recognizably Stoic, even if it wears different clothes. The tradition did not die. It mutated, it was absorbed, it ran underground and resurfaced in new forms. And in our own time, in the specific form of contemporary Stoicism, it has returned again to almost exactly where it started, the practical question of how to live. How to bear difficulty. How to want what is worth wanting. How to be present in a world that is not organized around any individual's needs, and to find, in that fact, not despair but a kind of clarity that the fantasy of a differently organized world could never provide. 16. What remains? We are moving, now, toward the end of our night's journey through Stoicism. But before we arrive at the end, I want to say something about what these three men, the emperor, the statesman, the former slave, actually share, underneath all the differences of circumstance and personality and style that distinguish them from one another. They share a particular kind of courage. Not the dramatic courage of the battlefield, though Marcus Aurelius had that too, and Seneca showed it at the end, and Epictetus lived in conditions that required it daily. The quieter courage of the person who decides to look at their own life honestly, who decides to examine their own thoughts and desires and fears without flinching from what they find, who decides that the examined life is actually worth the examination, worth the discomfort, worth the revision of comfortable illusions, worth the effort of practice that is required to bring the theory into actual contact with actual living. This courage, let us call it the philosophical courage, is in some ways the most rare, because it does not require any particular external circumstances. It does not require a war, or a crisis, or an extreme situation to bring it out. It requires only the decision, made quietly and renewed daily, to look clearly at what is actually happening in your mind and your life, and to respond to it with the best that your reason can provide. That decision is available to you. Right now. Not tomorrow. Not after you have solved the current problems, or achieved the current goals, or arrived at the circumstances that you imagine will finally make the examined life practical. Now. In the exact conditions you are in, with the exact resources you have, with the exact difficulties that are present. That is the Stoic message stated as plainly as it can be stated. And if it sounds demanding, it is, but it is demanding in the way that a good teacher is demanding, not harshly, not without acknowledgement of how hard it is, but with the deep conviction that you are capable of meeting the demand. Marcus Aurelius did not achieve perfection. He writes about this honestly, in entries that would be embarrassing if they were not so clearly genuine. He kept failing to do the things he knew he should do. He kept being moved by things he had decided should not move him. He kept needing to be reminded of lessons he had understood theoretically for years. And he kept, patiently and without drama, returning to the practice. Getting up in the cold morning and writing again. Thinking again. Trying again. Seneca did not achieve perfect consistency between his philosophy and his life. He had more money than he needed. He wrote flattery when flattery was politically necessary. He stayed in a court that he knew was corrupt longer than he perhaps should have. And he wrote about all of this, with a directness that transforms what might have been hypocrisy into something more honest. Testimony about the gap between the ideal and the actual, which is the universal human condition described clearly rather than concealed. Epictetus, perhaps because his conditions had stripped away so many of the things that distract from clarity, came closest, in his recorded words, to the Stoic ideal. His voice has a quality of tested certainty, a quality that comes from having thought these things through not only in the quiet of philosophical conversation but in the actual conditions of an own body, a restricted life, a world in which freedom was not a given but a specific achievement of the inner life. When he says, "The tyrant cannot imprison your proherasis," he has had reason to test the claim. These three are the tradition at its most alive. They are the ones who speak most directly to us, the ones whose voices carry most clearly across the distance of 2,000 years, whose sound, when you read them carefully, less like ancient authorities and more like people who have been through something and are telling you about it plainly. And the answer they arrived at, refined across generations, tested in extreme circumstances, written down in the dark, or in exile, or in the presence of death, is something like this. You are a rational being. That capacity, for reason, for reflection, for the deliberate choice of how to respond, is the most essential thing you are. It cannot be taken from you. It can be obscured, certainly. It can be neglected. It can be overwhelmed by passion, by distraction, by the accumulated weight of unexamined experience. But it cannot be removed. And in that capacity lies everything that genuinely matters: the ability to do good, to treat others justly, to see clearly, to act with courage, to face what is coming without flinching, to love what you love without making your peace conditional on keeping it forever. Everything else is on loan. Everything else will be returned. The body will go. The position will go. The people will go. The empire will go. Even Rome went, eventually its stones repurposed for churches, its Latin transformed into the languages we speak today. The plague will pass, or not pass, and either way the response will have been what the response was. What remains in the Stoic account is not a possession. It is a practice. The daily, imperfect, endlessly renewable practice of trying to live as reason suggests you might. Of trying to want the right things, and fear the right things, and respond to what happens with the faculties that centuries of human reflection have placed at your disposal. Not because you will succeed perfectly. Not because the practice guarantees outcomes. But because the practice is, itself, the good. The practice is, itself, the life worth living. Not the results of the practice. The practice. That is what these three men, in their different lives, in their different tones, with their different emphases and different struggles, were trying to say. That is what survives of them, across 2,000 years of history that have dissolved everything else: the empire, the court, the school, the marble, the names of almost everyone who lived in that time. The practice survives. And it is available, right now, to anyone who wants to take it up. 17. The ground beneath you. You are still here. If you have been following along, if these words have been accompanying the slow settling of your body into rest, the gradual release of the day's holdings, the drift toward the particular quality of attention that exists on the edge of sleep, then you know that we have covered a great deal of ground tonight. Athens in 300 BC, and a merchant who became a philosopher at a roofed colonnade. A camp along the Danube, and an emperor writing to himself in Greek before dawn. A villa in the Bay of Naples, and a man composing letters he knew would outlast him. A school in northwestern Greece, and a former slave speaking with the freedom that cannot be taken from anyone who truly understands what freedom is. We have moved through the three pillars, logic, physics, ethics, and through the core disciplines, the discipline of desire, the Premeditatio Malorum, the evening review, the view from above. We have looked at what the Stoics thought about anger, and friendship, and the body, and virtue, and the radical claim that only virtue is genuinely, unconditionally good. And I want to say something now, in the quieter register that this hour calls for, about what all of this might mean for you. Not in general. Right now. You have had a day. Some part of it was probably difficult. Some part of it was probably ordinary, in the way that most of a human life is ordinary, not heroic, not catastrophic, just the steady movement through the hours that most of living actually consists of. Some part of it may have been genuinely painful. And you have arrived here, at this hour, carrying whatever the day left with you. The Stoics would not tell you to put down whatever you are carrying. They would tell you something more precise than that. They would tell you to look at it. To see, as clearly as you can manage in the quiet of this hour, what part of what you are carrying actually belongs to you, what part is within the space of your reason and your response, and what part is the weight of things that are not yours to carry. What part is the residue of outcomes you could not have controlled? What part is the elaboration, in the mind, of difficulties that have already passed and cannot be changed? What part is the anticipatory anxiety about things that have not yet happened and may not happen in the form the anxiety imagines? You do not have to solve this tonight. That is not what this hour is for. This hour is for rest. For the body's renewal and the mind's settling and the particular grace of sleep, which has been one of the great mercies of biological life since before any philosophy existed to think about it. But the Stoic practice is available to you even now, in this softest possible form. Let the day be what it was. Let the things that are not yours to control be returned to the category of things that are not yours to control. Let the part that is yours, the quality of your attention, the orientation of your will, the small and persistent choice to try, let that remain yours, as it always was, as it cannot be taken. The ground beneath you is real. You have been standing on it all day, whether you felt it or not. The capacity for reason, for response, for the examined life, it has been there through all of it. Through the moments when it was obscured by the day's pressures. Through the moments when you acted from something smaller than your best self. Through the moments when you were exactly the person you want to be, and through the ones when you were not, and through all the ordinary moments in between when you were simply there, moving through the hours, the ground beneath you, whether you felt it or not. Marcus Aurelius is writing, right now, in a sense that exists in the strange relationship between the past and the present that reading creates. He is bent over his wax tablet in the lamplight of the military camp, composing a reminder to himself that he will need again tomorrow. The lamp is small. The night is large. The frontier is waiting. And he writes, you have this day. Only this day. The work of a human being is reason. Rise and do what reason requires. Seneca is composing, in the library of a villa, a letter to Lucilius about time. About the way time disappears. About the importance of gathering it up, of treating each portion of it as something real and scarce and worth living fully. He is writing, reclaim yourself. For the time you have been given is enough, if you know how to use it. And Epictetus is speaking to a room of students in Nicopolis, in a voice that Arian is trying to write down fast enough to catch, about the distinction between what is yours and what is not. About the prohairesis, the rational faculty, that no master and no emperor and no circumstance can reach. He says it plainly, without decoration, the way you say something that you know from the inside. This cannot be taken from you. This is free. This is yours. They are all saying it. In different voices, from different positions in time and space and social experience. They are all saying the same thing, which is what philosophy says when it is actually working: you are more than you think. The ground you are standing on is more solid than it feels. And the practice, the small, daily, imperfect, endlessly renewable practice, is the whole thing. Not the destination. The practice is the whole thing. Let that settle now. Let the thoughts that have been moving through you tonight move a little slower. Let the ideas find their level, the way water finds its level, not by being pushed but by being allowed to settle. Some of what we have explored tonight will stay with you. Some will return at unexpected moments, in the middle of a difficult conversation, or in the early morning before anyone else is awake, or in the particular kind of clarity that sometimes arrives in the last few minutes before sleep. Some will fade, and that is all right. You can return to these men, to these texts, at any time. They are patient. They have been waiting for 2,000 years. They can wait for you. What the Stoics ultimately offer is not a formula. It is a direction. A direction toward clarity, toward honesty, toward the difficult and productive work of becoming more genuinely yourself, the self that is capable of reason, of justice, of courage, of the kind of love that does not need to control what it loves. That direction is available to you. Not tomorrow. Now. 18. The night, and the stars, and what they knew. There is one more thing, and it is not philosophical, or not only philosophical. It is an image that the Stoics themselves seem to have returned to, that appears in Marcus Aurelius, and in the hymn of Cleanthes, and in Seneca's descriptions of looking at the night sky from his villa, and that I want to leave you with as this night draws toward its rest. The Stoics believed that the universe was alive. Not metaphorically. Genuinely alive, organized by a rational principle, the Logos, that expressed itself in the movements of the planets, and the cycles of the seasons, and the structure of living things and the capacity for reason in the human mind. The same force that moves the stars moves you. Not a distant force operating on you from outside. The same force. Present in you, as it is present in everything, as the power of rational organization, of Logos in the human sense, of the capacity to step back from the immediate and see it more clearly. When Marcus Aurelius looked up from his writing and stepped out of his tent and looked at the stars above the Danube camp, and he did look at them, the Meditations make this clear, he was someone who found in the night sky a specific and recurring comfort. He was not looking at something separate from himself. He was looking at the larger expression of the same thing that was writing in the lamplight, reason, made visible at a scale that dwarfs the human, but not therefore alien to the human. The same thing, in different scale. When Seneca, in one of the letters, describes going outside at night and looking up and feeling something that he struggles to find words for, something like kinship, something like recognition, he is pointing at this. The Stoic cosmology is not religion in the sense of requiring belief in things unsupported by observation. But it has something of the quality of certain deep experiences, the sense that you are part of something larger than yourself, that the larger thing is not indifferent to you because you are made of it, that the rationality in you is genuinely connected to the rationality in the whole. This is what the Stoics called the brotherhood of rational beings. Not only humans. There was serious philosophical debate about which animals qualified, which shows the rigor with which the Stoics pursued these questions. But certainly humans, all humans, regardless of their station in the Roman social hierarchy, slave and emperor alike, reasoning by the same rational principle, participating in the same cosmic logos, citizens of the same world. Marcus writes, somewhere in the middle sections of the Meditations, something that stays with me, that 1,000 years from now, it will make no difference whether you acted well or poorly, because the stars will still be turning and the world will still be moving and all the specific anxieties of your specific day will have dissolved into the general silence of time. And then he immediately writes the counter-argument, but it does matter now. It matters because you are here now, and the rational faculty is here now, and the choice to act well is available now, and to waste that availability, to be the person who could have lived by reason and did not, is the only genuine failure. Both things are true. The long view, which sees the smallness of any individual life against the enormity of time, is true. And the immediate view, which sees the fullness and weight and moral significance of this specific moment, is also true. The Stoics did not choose between them. They held both. They let the long view drain anxiety without draining meaning. They let the immediate view provide urgency without producing panic. That is the balance. That is, perhaps, the whole thing in its final form. The stars that Marcus saw from the Danube camp are the same stars. Not metaphorically. The same stars, some of them. In slightly different positions, because the sky changes slowly over 2,000 years, but recognizably the same. The light that left them when Marcus was a young man, receiving the lectures on Epictetus that would shape his entire philosophical life, that light is still traveling. It has been traveling for 2,000 years. It is not here yet. You are here. Right now. Under the same sky that held the same stars that these three men looked up at, in their different places and different circumstances, and found, each of them, a version of the same thing, the sense that the rationality in them was real, was the most real thing about them, was connected to something larger than any individual life could contain, and was, in every circumstance, available. Let your breathing slow now. Let the thoughts that have been moving settle a little further. You have been traveling tonight, not far in physical space, but far in time, and in the kind of space that ideas occupy, which does not have a name but is real. You have spent time with people who thought carefully about the things that matter most, and you have heard what they concluded, and whether any of it lodges or stays or changes anything in the way you see your own life, that is entirely for you to decide. There is no pressure here. There is no exam. There is only the quiet of this hour, and the weight of your body, and the slow rhythm of your breathing, and whatever remains of the day settling into its final stillness. The emperor is writing. The statesman is composing. The teacher is speaking in a room where the students are bending toward their tablets trying to catch his words. And somewhere, between their world and yours, the same ground holds. Sleep well. Wherever you are in the world tonight, whatever the hour, whatever the weight, the ground beneath you is the same ground it has always been. Reason is available. The practice is possible. And there is nothing more required of you tonight than this: to let the day be what it was, to let the body do its slow repair, to let the mind find the particular freedom that sleep provides, that ancient, biological, universal mercy that has been offered to every human who has ever lived, every ancestor who lay down in the dark and allowed consciousness to loosen its grip for a few hours, every person who has found, in the suspension of waking effort, the renewal that the next day's effort will require. You have walked a long way today. Set down what you have been carrying. The ground will hold it. Rest now. The stars are where they always were. And I will see you in the comments.